Welcome, welcome. This is Archetypal Hour. My name is Adam, and I'm joined by Hoda and Psychonaut and Lexi. And today, at least in this part of the world, it is Mother's Day, 2024. Hey, Turquoise, what you doing over here? My bird just came very close by, eating paper. All right, sorry, I get distracted easily. When we're talking, because it is Mother's Day, it just, since we started talking, checking in with each other, of course, Mother wanted to be a part of this container. So we're talking a little bit about the Mother archetype, um, and um, and we kind of started the conversation a little bit. It kind of led us to this place, which I kind of will leave space for it to kind of reemerge again, but I'll do my best to recapitulate some of what I was hearing Hoda speak about. But really this, thinking about this mother connection to, well, a couple of things, but the one that's coming up right now is like that through the mother archetype, especially maybe even what it means to like go within and mother ourselves and really like honor what that archetypal mothering means to us in a way. And how that archetype, that pattern, that movement, can really potentially open up some really interesting portals or sort of roots diving down into like the primordial. So like really deep stuff. And we were also talking a little bit about like separation wound or separation just in general, like this idea of separation, because when you talk about mother, you can't help but talk about this idea of separation, right? Because you have this child that is the mother. It, for all intents and purposes, is a part of the mother completely. It is one organism. And then at some point, there is a separation where there's now two organisms, but that's not how it feels. What's up, Turquoise? You really coming over to say hi? Turquoise, you got thoughts? He really is looking at me like he has something to say. I'm sorry, I had to take a break to make sure I heard him. All right, maybe he's saying it's time to let someone else talk. But I wanted to, yeah, maybe Hoda, I don't know if you want to help me pick up the parts of the threads that feel juiciest to you before we started recording. But this primordial piece, this mothering self piece, were some things that were really interesting that I thought could be fun to start us off. But I want to check in with you and check in with everybody else.
Yeah, and I'm definitely holding space, I guess, to sort of like, yeah, like bridge in the context that was here in the conversation, like before we started recording. Yeah, I feel like for me, what I was speaking to and like brought in is this piece from a podcast that I heard a couple of years back, which I'll share later in the thread, and maybe we can get in the episode link later on. But besides that, this podcast had brought up the point of how a relationship to nature, a refreshed perspective on our ongoing relationships, and refreshed, in this particular podcast, she was speaking to a refreshed relationship to one's work can, these perspective shifts that are like available to us at any time, I'll say. The podcast host was speaking to how these can be containers basically where the awe and the wonder and the beauty that we saw being mirrored in our childhood can be reflected back to us in very daily, concrete ways. And then I know for me, after listening to that podcast, now this was years ago, just to kind of like situate us into time, I feel like for me, that's been a big piece of like what I generally reflect on in my practice. And then because today's Mother's Day on the Gregorian calendar, it feels like it's just touching on this place where, yeah, like you said, Adam, there are circumstances where we do just have to like buck up, mother ourselves, and how those situations can help us refine the way that we mother, and mothering is also like, so like we talked about the colloquial, like cultural kind of like part of mothering too, which is like girl you're slaying, or like boy you're slaying, or non-gender like y'all are
Yeah.
swaying, so you're wondering. And so like, yeah, there's just these layers I feel like that are coming up that I feel like for me are situated very cleanly in what you said, where there's the interpersonal links between motherhood that bring me towards these primordial connections with like um the divine mother or different goddess archetypes. um and so yeah, I'm curious what that brings up for y'all, or if your journey has looked similar, where you find that like you're nurturing yourself through a relationship or not.
Mm. I'm really, it's funny, I see in the chat too, Lexi mentioned childlike innocence. And like, yeah, that was also standing out to me too, that like this sort of play of being able to return to childhood in a sense, being part of the inner mothering is really interesting, and like tapping into that kind, those kind of like energetic signatures and vibrations. And then you mentioned like awe and wonder. And I think earlier, I don't know if you mentioned it just now, but I know before the recording, that relationship of safety, like that the mother can create a safe place for this sense of awe and wonder to be able to like fully come out. Um, so that feels really, yeah, that's really beautiful. Um, and then yeah, the interpersonal too. Yeah, so I'm just sitting with that too, and like that childlike sense of wonder and safety is really standing out to me. Like the ability to, yeah, to provide that kind of space. Mm. And I mean, it is funny. Like I just keep thinking about like that sense of childlike wonder, like that space where like really anything is possible, where you're just fully present. Like there's something about when I even think about that. Like if I were like when I go into my own like just kind of psyche and play with like, okay, let me bring up this sensation of being a child. Like usually the images that I get are like I'm playing this game that used to be called Jailbreak, where you chase people and play hiding. Like usually I'm going back to a memory where I'm playing Jailbreak and like I'm just so alert to what's happening because I'm hiding in a bush. But like just like being one with nature in that moment, feeling the insects at night, feeling like the sound and humming of like life, and just being present where like there's this sense, at least when I go back into that sense of a childhood memory of yeah, just like the freedom to play, and just there's no need to think about anything. You're just there in the moment. Um and then yeah, there's some great stuff in the chat here about safety too. And like how, yeah, like if a child, for the child to be able to play safely, like the mom has to make that space possible for them, physically especially, with a child, right? But also psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally.
I think that's the really interesting thing because like I was talking about how I kind of feel like, and I'm not the first person to have this thought. It's been said many times before that, as our parents get older, we kind of become our parents, right? And it kind
Mm-hmm.
of feels like as my parents age, I'm sort of returning that motherly energy back to my mother, and Hoda asked how that is, and it's kind of like it's a hard question to answer because like it kind of feels like raising a child in a way because sometimes it's really frustrating,
Mm-hmm.
and my mom will just be talking about like some crazy bullshit that she read on Facebook, and you gotta like take your parents by the hand, and like walk them like around that kind of stuff and be like, okay, like this is some crazy bullshit, like just relax, and like explain it to them like a parent would explain something to a child, you know what I mean? But then like, you know, at other times it feels like enlightening and like growth is happening, when you can create like those safe spaces because that dynamic of parent and child still exists. But as you age, you can create that safe space for your parents too to
Mm-hmm.
feel like they can be vulnerable with their children, and they
Mm,
can be authentic and that sort of stuff. And if you can create that safe space for them where they feel able, to engage with that kind of stuff, then you can have that growth. And it's fascinating, it's to
yeah.
watch your parents grow like that and be able to create that safety for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Alexi shared in the chat, like what comes to me is the safety allows for embodiment in my experience. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you're talking about with like, the authenticity and the vulnerability and like being able to actually receive a message. And also like I find it really interesting that you said reflect back the motherly energy. And I feel like that connects at least lexically to like something that Hoda said also about like this inner journey of like reflecting the childlike wonder and awe from our childhood back. At least, I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly, Hoda, but like, I think it's interesting you both had this phrase of reflecting back. Like, it just makes me think of like this ability of this motherly energy to just sort of like continue to move, right? Like, this constant light that's getting reflected among all these bodies moving in space and time. Mm. Hmm. I'm also laughing at like the having to like prevent malicious thought forms from Facebook from taking over the conversation or the mindscape. Oh man.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about that in relation to what you said, Psychonaut, where I'm like, I definitely feel like at some point, I feel like for me, it happened pretty early in full transparency, where I was like, it was pretty esoteric. And I'll share this with y'all, where basically, like, I was 20 something, like 21, 22, living in my own apartment, just kind of like, living the young adult, like, American experience. And I remember having like a dream. And I think I've shared with y'all before, like how dreams, and I think this can be true for anyone, where dreams can kind of act as like a portal for me sometimes. And I remember having a pretty intense dream. I won't get into what the dream was, but I just remember like waking up and telling my roommate, like, I feel like I have to move home, dude. And she was like, why? And I was like, I don't know. Like, and we were like 21 or like 22. And so in this context, like having to have such an existential conversation with my friend was really hard. But as like time went on, I moved back home. I realized that like, I don't know if the call was like ancestral or if it was like cosmic or whatever, but I felt this call that was like, it's time to move home and like take care of your parents. And it wasn't from like a place where it was like, okay, like they couldn't take care of themselves or like they can't, but there was this like particular type of stewardship that I was like called to do with my parents. Um that I feel like is still true, like even to this day. Like in the example that you shared, Psychonaut, what I can relate to is what you said about that, like these ideas that my parents, because they're not tech savvy, from a couple generations older than me, I feel like I have to help them like field things like the ideas and like the news posits that they're have access to. I feel like another thing that I tend to do is like I'm like the child that's like very mindful of like what my parents eat. So like there's like so many different contexts, but like for me personally, I can definitely relate to that where it's like I felt that palpable shift into being a child that was receiving the mothering, receiving the care, receiving the support, to now being the party who is giving the care or reflecting the care, right? To kind of stay with this example of containment that the mothering energy um, brings out of us. And I think, again, it's not just, to me, associated with just like one gender. I know that there's so many people embodied who are taking care of parents.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like in many lineages, it can be a threshold of like the line that makes divides, I guess, like a community's understanding between childhood and like motherhood or fatherhood or elderhood
Mm.
is
Mm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I love this phrase elderhood too. I think that's like it's it's one of those phrases too where it's like now I'm kind of like this is such a tangent, but like I'm realizing now why people will often create new words for concepts because there's just something about hearing a word that like elderhood, for instance, is a word doesn't have a lot of correspondence with me. So it allowed a lot like I don't know. It's a different feeling when you hear a word that you don't really have a lot of correlations to, right? They can just sort of allow the image to come up. But I really like the phrase elderhood because I feel like it speaks to this. Yeah, like an elder is just further ahead, and there are some experiences that we have where we are further ahead. Um, I would say I don't know further ahead, but I'm curious now the etymons too of elder, but like that's the phrase that came up for me. And like, yeah, especially when it comes to the internet and miscommunication and like mass communication now, we are ahead of our parents. We've grown up in it. We've had to deal with it a little bit differently. We see it differently. Um, and yeah, it's a real problem. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but wanted to let folks chime in. I'm gonna check the chat. Hmm. Yeah, the chat is talking about like, yeah, like how sketchy it is. I remember like it was just a weird moment too. Like, okay, this is like a little bit of a more of a funny but rude aside, where my brother had to like um help clean up some viruses that my grandfather had attracted through unsavory websites, in his widowerhood. Um, and like, what a ridiculous thing, right? Like, it's such a funny situation to be like the grandson having to be like, Grandpa, you can't, you can't be downloading from these sites, dude. Anyway, speaking of elderhood and motherhood, this is a great question. Hoda says, I'm curious if there are any goddess archetypes that have taught you all how to mother yourself. Oof. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly I grew up with Mary, and I feel like I did learn a lot about motherhood from Mary, for sure. Although I feel like for me, like I learned about Mary more less from the Bible and even the stories, more from my grandmother's devotion to her and how meaningful it was, and how I was like, well, Noni, she taps into Mother Mary, and it's doing wonders for her. What about you? Any goddess archetypes that have been really prominent for you? What I was asking about what that looked like. It looked like a lot of Hail Marys and the rosary beads. Um, that was the main one that I saw outwardly. But I also trying to think back of anything else that's standing out. But those beads are the main one, and hearing her name over and over again. Mm. Yeah, she was a praying woman, that's for sure. And she would do the whole mass under her breath. It was always fun sitting next to her because you were like, man, she's just going. She just never stopped talking through the whole mass under her breath. It was really quite beautiful. Probably channeling now that I know some different things, right? But back then I didn't know what it was, but I thought it was interesting. It was hugely influential on me to see someone like that, though, for sure. Oh, your grandmother to the T. That's funny. Yeah, man.
Yeah, I actually feel like maybe I asked the question a little presumptuously because now I'm more curious about any like feminine figures in you all's life, whether personally or like through like your interaction with like art and media, have like shaped your devotional practice. Cause I'm like, yo, as you were speaking about your nona, I'm like, I was literally entranced as a child, following around my grandmother when she would do her devotionals and prayers and her dhikr. Um, and it was like it was majestic to me. Like I was a child who had like trouble sleeping, and I noticed like even from like as young as like 4 that like when my grandmother would be in the room praying, and like okay, like in Islam there's like 5 prayers a day, but like she would be in prayer all day, man. She was so good. And like the field of the room would change and I would sleep, and like her presence would like affect my dreams. And like even as a kid, I was like, yo, this woman is going hard, yo. Like, like she is, and it makes me think of that Andre 3000 verse where he's like, there's nothing more shielding attractive than a heavy praying woman. Um,
Mm,
and so now I'm kind of curious, like what kind of archetypes have shaped the way that you mother not only yourself, but mother other containers that you answer to or respond to or feel called to tend to?
mm,
Like who has shaped that? Like who's the figure that's like behind all of that devotion for yourself, if y'all can place it?
mm, mm. It's funny. I'm finding like some odd like difficulty with this question because something about mothering and then like orientation toward the self is sort of like conflicting a little bit in my psyche for some reason. Isn't that
So
interesting?
I'm having the same kind of experience, and I'm kind of digging around it a little bit, and this is gonna be a little bit spicy, but I think for me personally, it was growing up in such a patriarchal family.
Mm,
Um, and because of that, a lot of those sort of mothering energies were repressed within our family. So for me, and I'm kind of like searching for like the source of like, like where do I have this knowledge from, you know? And there are certain like archetypal things that I could pull on, like Bridget and various goddesses like that. But um, I think that this is part of my frustration with this topic because, like, especially when it kind of comes to like, holding, my mother's hand and walking her through like Facebook conspiracy theories and like stuff like that, for like the millionth time, telling my mom that like Joe Biden won the election and that's okay, because I didn't have those experiences, because those energies were repressed in in my family, in my childhood, you know and now I'm struggling with this, right? And I
mm,
have to like get up and over this because like I don't know how to mother myself properly, I don't know how to mother the people around me properly, and it just becomes like this another example of like why misogyny is deeply harmful to men within society, because
mm,
we don't know how to fucking do this,
mm, mm, mm.
we have no frame of reference for how to extend that to ourselves. I think most potently to ourselves, but also others.
Yeah. Wow. And I think it kind of like to me like even more amplifies the importance of this question Hoda was asking about like in terms of like a good use, at least I think like an aligned use of archetypes, right? Of like looking for archetypes for those frames of reference to just get the ball rolling and to experience those energies firsthand. Um, and I did think of something too, like something shook loose of like mothering myself at feeding. And I mean, maybe that's not always the best thing, right? In terms of being misaligned use of food, but like when I think of mothering, I'm thinking of like, wow, when do I mother myself, or how does that look? And it's like feeding myself, letting my have little treats, little snacks that I like, right? Like that, because that was my mom making sure I was feeding, eating. My noni also, my other grandmother Mamie that I used to call her, like always having candies, like being fed. right? And that's what the child needs the mom for food. So like that's the main one. Is like I hadn't really thought about, but I think that there is sort of like, and that's what people use food for healing too sometimes, right? Which can get into really misaligned ways. But like that, yeah, that came up for me, the mothering. But like I think I appreciate what you said so much, Psychonaut, and thank you for sharing. And like yeah, just like how that patriarchal energy can crowd out the motherly energy. And I am
Oh,
curious. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
well, and I think there's an additional thing to be said for, um, sorry, voice isn't great today. Um, I think there's an additional thing to be said for pulling in those archetypes as well, because a lot of these archetypes come out of a time and place where, um, child rearing in particular was a much more communal endeavor. So that mothering energy was much more accessible, not just on the level of, genetic relation, but on the level of community as well, which I think is just like a whole, that's a whole nother level
Whoa.
of that energy that like a lot of
Yeah.
us just don't fucking have access to anymore. I live very far away from the rest of our extended family, and that was only on my father's side. I had no access to my mother's side of the family.
Wow.
So, you know, um, yeah, it's just like a whole other level of having access to that energy.
Yeah. Gosh, I had so many crazy things come into my when you were speaking, Psychonaut, about like, but they're just ridiculous conjecture that is coming into me for some reason. I'll just say that like I think what you're drawing this distinction to about like for some reason I want to use the word like the atomization of society, like these sort of like the nuclear families, right? At least in America, this sort of cultural trend, but also how like if you combine misogyny and patriarchy with further atomization, yeah, the child has so much less access to like the variety of energies that can be expressed through humanity. Um, and then somehow that got me thinking about like, damn, like this generation, the boomer generation that's, roughly in their 70s, and the folks that we're kind of roughly talking about, um, how at least in America, a lot of them, like, these were kids that were the first kids to be grown up on television. And then how I was thinking, like, how, like, TV became the village when this atomization thing happened, and how strange that is that, like, sometimes the archetypes of, like, sitcom parents ended up being hugely helpful to kids because they had at least a feminine archetype that they could like connect with and know that that energy exists. And I'm just thinking how strange that is to think about like TVs actually being helpful because we don't think of it that way. I think it's one of those things where it's now I'm coming to a place where I can see the neutrality and everything. But anyway, I'm gonna pull myself out of this like conjecture hole that I fell into. But yeah, I'm curious about like what other I'm thinking about this communal piece too because I feel like that is really interesting with mother archetypes and maybe the lack of them in the community, especially in patriarchal societies.
Oh, you're gonna pull back from the conjecture, but I'm gonna dive deep into it and maybe even say that the cultural zeitgeist of a particular nation becomes, that child's frame of reference for the community in which they live.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and and this becomes even weirder when we start to consider the ability of content creators to create things like on YouTube and child programming on YouTube, where a particular, cultural um, frame becomes the community that a child gets immersed in childhood. It's a very strange thing to consider the implications of because I used to be a social worker, and that's what they kind of watched all the time, was um, like child's programming on YouTube, you
Yeah.
know, rather than, Disney Channel or Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon. Um, and there's definitely something removed from that. I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but I think that we as humans kind of reach out and try to create that community, um, just sort of de facto, right?
Mm.
So that that culture kind of becomes the child's community as they're kind of searching to fill that hole of community, in their life and in their development.
Hmm. Dang. Well, at
Yeah,
the same time, what's
chew
that?
chew on that. Chew on that.
Yeah, no, it's just yeah, I want to like hold space to bring in other perspectives. Um, but yeah, just yeah, I'm just kind of feeling into what you're saying, and like, yeah, it's even hard because at the same friend, right? There's also less because of these same friends. There's just less community happening in many neighborhoods across, at least in the United States. Mm. Yeah, I mean, how did that? I mean, like, is TV real community? And it can't be real community. It's like one of these things where it's like there's some nuggets that could be pulled out that could be useful. But think about the difference between like 1950s television programming, which had its own sort of propaganda, but also was a bit more innocent, truthfully. And sort of like what Psychonauts saying, like this sort of turn of content on YouTube. And also like TV was a little bit more of a community when it was contained. When there's 5 channels, your neighbor is, Abbott and Costello. If you go back way back, but Lucille Ball, and Des, like there weren't that many people there. It was more contained. Yeah, like that. Thank you, Hoda. Yeah, and so I mean, it's never really. It's an artificial community though. Like I do think like I've been thinking about this so much. I don't know if it's because Rahu and Pisces or whatever. I cannot tell you how much I've been obsessed with thinking about television and movies for the last like year. Just trying to like wrap my head around like what that really has done to humanity because it's so damn new. Like we pretend like this shit's been around forever. It's barely been around. Like the folks we're talking about is the first people to grow up with it. Like what the hell has this thing done? These moving pictures. What have they done to us? For good and bad. Anyway, I feel like this rabbit hole feels so much different than the mother archetype, but let me stop. Let me stop and just sort of check in with folks. I feel like Psychonaut might be adding more fuel, so I want to hear from you, Psycho, but I want to hear from Hoda too, or Lexi, like to save us. Yeah, Lexi's bringing it in. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Thank you.
No, sorry. Yeah, yeah. If you could read out what Lexi said.
Yeah, Lexi said reminds me also of parasocial media and false senses of community and connection. Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, and I'm kind of glad that we went down that conjecture rabbit hole because I feel like that's kind of like the thought processes that, like, it mirrors the thought processes that I think have like allowed like the culture that we're in to like remain
Mhm.
static, like because I feel like a regenerative culture, right? Which I don't know if any country or nation has down packed, but like a regenerative culture would probably learn from the data that they had from like the
Mhm.
first 20 years of like television programming and either change the television programming in a responsive way or like curtail television programming to be local or but I'm not in broadcast, so I don't know if I could change those things. So, but that's just like one place that my mind goes. So I'm glad this conjecture was brought up because I feel like it forces us to think about things. Um, but I do, so I'm grateful for that. But another thing that did come up for me was like, okay, like this idea of like mothering in safe containers. Again, not having to be attached to a particular mothering figure. I think that that's just what came up for me. Um, yeah, like if television and like parasocial media, like Lexi brought up, false senses of community and connection are like, I just kind of think about even when I'm self mothering myself And I like remember the times my mom put me in front of a television was like when she was really busy, like super burnt out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm like, okay, I watch myself when I do that. Like I observe myself when I do that to myself, when I just start like binge watching TV and I'm just kind of like eating like no shade, like pizza pops. And then I'm just like drinking soda. And I'm like, okay, like this is, yeah, sure. Like my inner child might want this, but also like as somebody who like, you know, kind of tries to like stretch my awareness and all that kind of stuff, I'm like, okay, like what aspect of like my childhood self is showing up right now? And like, yeah, I guess in relation to like self-containment, I don't know. And I often do feel like when I go down like media rabbit holes or get super caught up in parasocial media, I'm like, it feels like I'm mirroring some aspects of like super shielding, like neglect. And I'm like, okay, like how can I curtail this with something more like generative, like what you and Lexi brought in? Like, how can I like feed myself something more like potent instead of just like wasting away in front of these programs as if they're going to be the thing that gives me the breakthrough about community, you know? Um, and I do want to say, to be fair, I'm coming from a place where I wasn't allowed to watch TV or like didn't have TV in my room. But I think that's just because like my parents are sensitive and they'll never admit it. But they didn't want me exposed to that kind of programming wantonly, even though it did happen at some places, you know? So yeah, I'm just kind of curious what that brings up for y'all. I know that y'all are not suggesting that TV replaces community, but I'm like, I wonder if there is an aspect of like self-mothering that evolves past. That's what it brings up for me now, like evolves past just duplicating the dynamics that we were like raised in, you know, or like duplicating the soil that our roots were like sown in, which could be a big. I don't know if I diverged too much, but yeah, curious what that brings up
No,
for you.
no, not at all. And I think like, yeah, I mean that I don't think that it should replace TV should replace community. It was just sort of like this question of like, has it in some ways for some people that are really atomized, and what has that done? I really like this sort of going back to like, yeah, sort of the evolution of mothering and how, yeah, how like are we always like looking at the full range of options is the way I want to like recapitulate it. And what are other options of that mothering? Um, and I feel like one of them is coming up too. And it's so hard. And this is one that I feel like I do, but I also don't always have the energy to do. And I feel so bad when I don't have the energy to do it. But it's like that deep listening. I remember actually one time, Nobu, in a Why Am I Like This? Maybe there was this question about like, but this ability to like listen to a child with your whole body, I think is the phrase he used. That stood out to me because like that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like when a mom, and in my case a dad, but like, you know, like you said, Hoda, like this is not really about gender. We're talking about a kind of archetypal energy. But like this idea of like just listening and like allowing the child to express, and there's no judgment. I mean, that's the thing that's so tough with being a mom too, is like you don't want to like you don't want to lie. You want to stay authentic, but you know, you might hear something that steps out of your preference, and it's like just allowing that openness to allow the child to literally express without having to stop them and nitpick them and scrutinize them. I feel like as a dad, like that's my the father archetype comes out that wants to scrutinize or add and say like, well, actually, did you know this? And it's like, damn, dad archetype, like not now. It's mom archetype mode. We're just listening. She's playing. She didn't ask you for anything. She's having fun. Why are we changing it up? Right? This like ability of the mom to like let the child just be the child. And like for me, like I'm almost tapping into those senses of like going back to like the other question about like how we can be mother to ourselves. That real power of like letting you be you. And I feel like my mom has given me that, my own mom, but other feminine um people in my life, including my dad. But like that mom energy has always looked like this acceptance um, of the child. This sort of, yeah, like you done fucked up, but I'm still here. I'm always going to be here. You can't fuck up that bad. That kind of unconditional love type vibe that I think you can tap into. Wanted to pull out and see what's coming up for people. Yeah, Hoda says, going back to what I was saying about like the dialing between father and mother, was like, he says, yes, the fathering sometimes I attribute it to this level of concision that mother responds to with that fluidity. Yeah, like this very different, like the fluid versus, yeah, I love that. Hmm. And Psycho, I see you talking about like down at the DNA level. I'm curious if you want to come off mute and share what's popping for you right now. Mm-hmm.
I didn't have a lot to particularly add to this. I just think that this particular, like, if we wanna bring like a biological element into it, particularly in terms of like mothering, um, the recognition that because mitochondria are so important. Without them, we don't live, right? And so many other forms of life don't live. And that DNA is purely matrilineal. It's just it's such an important part of our life and who we are, and just like by weight, the amount of what we are, right? And that ecosystem that exists within us is completely contained, within the matrilineal side um, of of our ancestry.
Damn. This really is driving home to me this going back to like what came up about the separation sort of wound, or this idea of separation, because I love what you're saying, because it's like through the mitochondrial DNA, we can't actually be separate. Like we can't unfractal ourselves. You know what I mean? Like we have all this inheritance. So no matter how separate we feel like we are, we're not separate. We're completely connected through this matrilineal, the matrilineal mitochondrial DNA, like all the way back. You know, what's separate? Huh? You can't even be separate if you tried. And of course, that's true on all levels, I think. But like you said, going to like the biological level, it's a really beautiful thing.
And they have traced back like mitochondrial like DNA to just like thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and we still carry that within us every single day. You know, we can't do anything without ATP, right? Every
Mm.
time you lift up every time you lift up your hand, you're reliant on that entire ecosystem within your body for the generation of ATP and everything else that mitochondria do. And that is a direct matrilineal trajectory through thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Mm. Mm. Talk about awe and wonder. You know what I mean? Mm. 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 I don't even know where to go. I'm just like sitting with that. Whew. Oh. Yeah, and I think what's coming up for me too is like what you're talking about brings us back to that word that Hoda it entered into the container of like primordial. And I mean like, we're talking about physicality and genes and such, but like I feel like this idea of like this going back, 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 back. Hmm. And how the mother and mother archetype can really like can bring us to that place of return. Just some funny stuff in the chat. Yeah. Wow. I feel like I'm not really sure. This is feeling kind of like a nice. This is there's a feeling of like resolution that's feeling like it's coming its way, but I don't want to force anything. What's coming up for y'all? I'm curious. Just basking in it. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. I just noticed, by the way, yo, I literally, as I'm sitting here, I'm just like, whoa, I'm hugging myself and rocking right now. So she said, hold up, curious what's coming up for you. Like, I'm literally like, I have my arms across my chest, under my shirt, so I can feel skin to skin, so to speak. And I'm like rocking back and forth, left and right on my hips. Like, what the hell? That is hilarious. That's where I ended up, Hoda. I think I'm rocking myself. Dang. Mother energy. Yes. What? Whew. Wow. Well, that's another way to do it, I guess. Sometimes I forget I can like massage myself too, and it's like the nicest thing. I recently started washing my feet way more intentionally whenever I feel like it. And like it's just so nice to be like, oh man, I forgot I could do this. This is great. So maybe a friendly reminder for anyone that's here live, but especially anyone listening asynchronously across space and time. And gosh knows how you found us and how the algorithm led you here. But if you're here in some weird way, or just here in a very commonplace straight line, this reminder of this mother archetype to be able to hug ourselves, to sway ourselves, to touch ourselves and massage our own feet in ways that just restore. Well, thank you to everybody um, for joining today, especially those lives. Thank you, Hoda. Thank you, Psychonaut. Thank you, Lexi. I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful week and has a wonderful experience in their near future with mothering or mother energy. Thank you all. Oh, I'm in the emoji bar. I'm right now trying to end the recording, y'all. I'm keeping this in the recording, I think, because it's so ridiculous that it makes me laugh. Where I'm trying to tell the bot to stop recording, and I can't. There it is. Stop. Thank you. Boom.